Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Underscore. My name is Shannon Howard. I'm the Director of Customer and Content Marketing at Intellum, and very excited to be talking with you all today about education-led growth. So we're going to talk about what it is, how it works, how we can use it to communicate the value of education to the business. So Underscore is a monthly series that we host to educate and inform the greater education community about what people are doing and what's working and what we've learned along the way. A little housekeeping before we dive in here. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to share it, if you want to come back to it later, take some more notes. If you have to hop off halfway, we are recording the webinar and you will automatically receive a copy of that recording, and it should be on the page that you're on right now. During this webinar, you can use the Q&A box underneath this video to both ask questions and also just say hi. We would love to hear who you are, who's here, where you're calling in from. So feel free to use that chat box or the Q&A box to communicate with us. Underneath this video, you'll also find a place where you can share your feedback and rate this session. I'll remind you again at the end, but this is really helpful for us to see what you're learning, what you like, what you don't like, and then also to share with us things that you want to learn, other topics that you want to see us cover in future underscores. So all that said, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Anderson. So Anderson's going to be walking us through the education-led growth framework today, but I'm going to give him a moment to just introduce himself both personally and professionally so you can get to know who he is.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. You can read the stuff that's on the slide. You're capable people. I live out in Portland, Oregon. My dog, if you're interested, his name's Wendell. He's a boxer. He's awesome. I'm an empty nester. My wife and I got married right out of college. We had kids in our mid-20s, so I have a 19 and a 21-year-old, but am still relatively young myself. So really excited about this next chapter, next phase of life and what that means for my wife and I. This is kind of a second career for me, being in product marketing and in SaaS tech, but I've been around education my entire professional life. So I had a whole first career in higher education where I was involved in teaching and in learning from traditional college students age, so like 18-year-olds just out of high school, all the way up through every age of adulthood. Some of my oldest students were in their 80s working on doctoral dissertations. So I've kind of seen all manner of adult learning. So I feel like I'm very comfortable when it comes to talking about education, regardless of the context. I lead product marketing here at Intellum, so I focus on how we position and message our products in the greater landscape and how try to communicate to you how that delivers value that you're looking for. And one of the things I really love about that role is the opportunity to bring together different parts of the organization. So usually product and sales and marketing and customer experience, including colleagues in education, and have us think about how do we communicate value and how do we message our products and our services in a way that is consistent across the entire organization, the entire life cycle of a prospect all the way through to a customer who is renewing, so that we are telling the same story from the same vantage points, just at different levels. I find that to be an incredibly fun and engaging challenge. And part of what we're going to talk about today is the role that education plays across all aspects of the organization. So kind of lifting our vision a bit above what we may typically think of as employee education or customer or partner education, and really looking at how to build a strategic program around education so that it has kind of tendrils into all aspects of the business.
Awesome. So maybe let's just get right into what is education-led growth. We've actually seen this term come up a lot more recently. I know it's showing up in my LinkedIn feed. So how are we defining it for the purposes of this webinar?
Yeah, so you can see the definition that's on the screen there. It's a strategic outcomes-focused approach that repositions education as a core driver of business success. For years at Intellum, we've been talking about how education can drive business impact. And what we're doing here now is we're taking this term, education-led growth, that really seems to fit what we've been doing at Intellum with our clients. And we're now trying to unpack that a little bit more and say, programmatically, how do you use education to drive growth? And what kinds of growth are you trying to drive? Because we think that we can help clients move from a place of education being perceived as a cost center, this kind of thing that we have to do and kind of put money into, to a growth driver, where you can really start to make the case that education, when done well and done throughout the organization, whether you're educating employees or educating external learners, that education, when done well, can have a significant impact on the success of a company's bottom line, of the metrics that matter to them. So we've kind of broken it down into 7 core pillars. So if you look at the pillars that are here, this education-led growth framework, you can see that this kind of influences every stage of the customer life cycle. So from acquisition, like even lead acquisition, all the way through customer retention, education-led growth can create really impactful and scalable programs that drive growth and loyalty and operational efficiency. And the 7 different pillars that you see here, from outcomes all the way to measurement, these all work together and in conjunction with one another to ensure that your education is intentional, that it drives measurable success, that it makes an impact on the business, and that the customer journey is pretty tightly integrated. I would note, I don't think that, even though we have them laid out in a line here, I don't think that this is necessarily a sequence that you have to run every educational initiative through. You don't have to start with outcomes and end with measurement. They kind of coexist and overlap. I like how we have them kind of all in one big blue bubble there, because these are all kind of parts of a whole, and how you graphically represent that. Like our graphic person is great. There's probably 30 different ways that she could have built a graphic to try to encapsulate that. But just like sales and marketing strategies and customer success strategies all kind of overlap together, and when done well, one bleeds into the other. It's kind of the same thing with these different pillars here. I mean, we present them here because if you were building an education program from scratch, then you may want to step through them in this particular order. But you may have education programs that you have already launched that are in flight, where you're nailing some of these things. Like, you know who your audience is. That is really well defined for you. So that may not be a pillar that you need to work on to improve that program, but you may want to look at resourcing for that program. Maybe that's something that you haven't considered before, is how do I make the case for better resourcing for this program, because that's going to help us with the continuous improvement and help us meet our outcomes. I know that when we've looked at education programs with clients, it's usually the pillars on either end there that we end up digging into the most with them. Like, what are the actual outcomes that you're trying to achieve through your program, and how are you going to measure those outcomes? And we'll be talking about what we've learned from our clients and from the market in general as we go throughout the rest of today. In fact, why don't we start with the first one of those? We'll just kind of step through each of these, right? So let's talk about business outcomes as the first of those pillars. When we look at business outcomes as it relates to education programs, I think what we're talking about here is defining measurable specific impacts, like the ones that you can see on the screen here. Things like revenue growth and customer retention, gains in efficiency. Anchoring education to those outcomes will help to ensure that what you're trying to do with your education programs is aligned with organizational goals that are bigger than just your program or your department. And you probably have a planning process in your organization where you define for the year, for the quarter, strategic initiatives, and then everything's supposed to map up to those, right? Well, this is what we're talking about with defining the business outcomes, or even just discovering the business outcomes that your education programs are meant to drive. You really want to start by showing that your education programs are a strategic contributor to the organization's success. So things that are probably pretty obvious to us in this space, customer and employee retention, right? That would be a valuable business outcome. Retaining your partners, revenue growth through new logo acquisition or existing customer base expansion, right? Increased ramp time for your employees or partners so that you're reducing the time to productivity That could be a business outcome. They all kind of funnel into what we found is one of these 4 buckets here, which map really nicely onto organizational outcomes. I have found when talking with education program leaders that oftentimes there's a little bit of translation work or a little bit of extra mapping work that we need to do for the organization to get our specific education program goal, like customer retention, kind of mapped back to the business outcome. How do we get there? I have found that using the 5 whys, probably a ton of you are already familiar with that, but using that kind of repetitive asking the question, why? Toyota did this a lot in some of their like process assessment. That can help get you to one of these 4 business outcomes. And then you come out with kind of a nice statement for how a particular education program is linked to a business outcome. I did this just the other day in preparation for our webinars. I was like, well, what would that sound like? You may start with the education program's goal is to drive product adoption, right? So then you would ask, well, why do we need to drive product adoption? The answer might sound like because customers who fully adopt our product are more successful in achieving their goals. Well, then the second why is, well, why do we need customers that are more successful in achieving their goals? Well, because when they're successful, they're more engaged with our product and they derive more value from it. Great. So why do we need customers to be more engaged, derive more value from a product? And you can kind of see how this goes all the way down. You get to that 5th why, and all of a sudden you're saying, well, why is it important to keep our existing customers rather than constantly acquiring new ones? And it's like, because customer retention is critical to long-term business stability. And so now you've gotten down into like sustainable growth, business stability. We need an education program to drive product adoption because doing so is going to improve customer retention. And just going through that exercise of being able to articulate, how does my customer education program, how does that connect back to a business outcome that the rest of the business cares about? I think that's an important foundational exercise so that when we're looking at the rest of these things, especially like the resourcing side of things, that you are already starting to build a case that the business should be supporting and investing in the success of your education programs because that's an investment in the success of the business's goals. Shannon, I think you have spearheaded a report on education-led growth, and I know you were going to weave some of that data from that report into our conversation today.
Yeah, so in November and December, we surveyed education leaders and professionals to get some insight on these things. So as we're trying to codify what is education-led growth, how do businesses use education to drive growth in these areas, right, through retention, revenue growth, performance, and cost reduction, what does that actually look like for real education programs in companies? And so this full research report is coming out next month, but you all are getting kind of the sneak peek at some of the data. So of the people that we surveyed, 70% of them were trying to use or were using education to drive revenue. Right. And so Anderson mentioned this could be new logo acquisition, new customers that we're bringing in, or it could be expanding existing customer accounts. Right. So when we think about why is product adoption helpful? Well, it helps to drive customer retention, but also expansion into new business units, new groups, increased users or seats, just kind of depending on what your product is, how you sell it. So trying to drive more revenue, not surprisingly, the majority of people are focused on retention, which could be employee retention, customer retention, partner retention, and some variety. So this did survey kind of a broad audience of people. And we'll talk a little bit about like who are people educating up next. 75% on performance. So you can think of performance. Anderson mentioned ramp time to productivity. We're becoming better at our jobs, right? So if you think more effective salespeople, more effective partners, more effective employees who are more efficient, more equipped for their job. And then cost reduction. I was actually surprised to see that only 57% of respondents said that cost reduction was something that was top of mind for them. Because often I think we think of education as decreasing cost, right? We're able to scale customer success, scale customer support, scale partner success with education. And so the data says, cost reduction is typically more of a concern for larger companies, right? That might have larger teams. And so operational efficiency is more of a concern than maybe smaller mid-market businesses that are more focused on revenue, retention, and performance.
And I think it's worth calling out there that kind of the surprise that we saw in that lower number with cost reduction being one of those business outcomes that people are explicitly tying their programs to. I think that also represents an opportunity that maybe some of the smaller and mid-market businesses have to be able to do more with less. Like we keep hearing that across tons of job functions, right? It's like, you got to do more with less. Well, one of the direct results of running a good strategic customer education program is the reduction of support tickets, the reduction of the costs associated with training and retaining customers. And so to start to draw a line there and make that an expectation of your education programs, that might be something that starts to play really, really well within a lot of organizations and businesses. Why don't we move on to the next pillar, already there. So the second thing that I think is important when you're building a customer education or an education-led growth program, or you're trying to assess your existing education programs, is understanding and defining the audience really well. I think this is probably one that many folks already do well when you're thinking. It's just part of the natural way of thinking about an education program. But I think we want to make sure that we're thinking about this strategically. One size fits all education just doesn't work. Most of us try it at some point in our education program careers, and we learn really quickly that trying to make a single program that's going to suit all of our learners means that none of our learners really get the value that we're looking for out of that education or out of that knowledge transfer. So understanding early on when you're building an education program, what are the distinct learner personas that I am expecting to engage with this program, and then tailoring your educational materials and your modes and your methods and your delivery to meet those unique needs, whether those are your customers or your partners or your employees, at different stages of those learners' life cycle. So how you treat new customers or new employees may be different than how you educate existing customers or existing partners on the exact same topic, because their learner needs are different. Their familiarity with your product or your services is different. So while there may be some overlap in the kinds of learning outcomes that you want, the audience acts as a lens or as a filter through which you then build out an education program specific to their needs. So it could be as simple as what you see here, right? Customers, partners, employees, prospects. But it could be more nuanced. You could look at customers who have accessed a particular module within 30 to 90 days of onboarding, or employees who are managers and team leads with direct reports, right? But that audience is usually tied to some sort of needs analysis that you're doing. What does this person or these people need to know in order to be successful, right? Successful with your product, successful in their roles, whatever success means when you're looking at your learners. What does our audience breakdown look like when we surveyed people? Shannon has all the data on that.
Yeah, so from the people that we surveyed, and you'll notice that these numbers do not add up to 100. And that's because a lot of people are educating multiple audiences, which I thought was great to see, because like Anderson's saying, yes, every audience is different, but often there are things that everybody needs to learn, right? That your customers, your partners, and your employees are all trying to learn how to use a part of your platform. And so that training may be the same. And so how do we think about the audiences that we're training, those outcomes we're driving toward, what they need to learn, and then finding a way to create content that's efficient and effective. So the majority of people that we surveyed are educating customers. A good chunk doing employee education, partner education. And probably important to note here is that employee education goes beyond learning and development, right? It can also be internal sales enablement or product enablement. So a lot of teams are training internal employees as well on how to use their product or how to sell their service. And then a lot of folks also doing prospect education, which I love to see. We'll talk a little bit more about marketing education programs later. But we'll move into more, right? So if we think about those 7 pillars, we're going to talk about them sequentially. They don't necessarily take place sequentially, but we'll talk about education initiatives next.
Right. So that's the third pillar, is what are the initiatives that you're trying to bucket your education underneath? And this one, I think, sometimes gets skipped by folks. You define the audience and then you go straight into creating content. But grouping your initiatives together, trying to define the purpose and the scope of your educational program, the collection of content that you create and deliver for onboarding is going to be different than what you're doing for skills enablement. And again, there may be some overlap, but being able to treat each of these initiatives as separate is going to make it even clearer to tie the efficacy of that program or that aspect of a program back to a business outcome. So onboarding, you could take that initiative and tie that directly back to retention. You might have different names for these: skills and enablement, onboarding, certifications, compliance. That's okay. But we find that these four cover almost all of the education initiatives that we see clients creating. The goal here is really just to simplify so you can tie groups of work back to the respective overarching business goals.
Yeah, so to that end, right, you'll get a data point for all of these things, right, and more data to come. The majority, 89% of people that we surveyed are focused on skills and enablement. So you can think of this as kind of that ongoing learning training, right? So we often think of education in onboarding, which 69% of respondents are focused on some kind of onboarding. But how do we keep people fresh and up to date as our product changes, as our industry changes, as how we sell changes, right? So how are we continuously educating our customers, partners, and employees throughout their journey with us? 64% doing certification, so more of a formalized program where you're learning, mastering a skill or a set of skills, and then there's some kind of, whether it's a big C, assessment, certification, proctored exam, or maybe a little C certification where it's just a learning a lot about a number of skills or things in your product, and then kind of a stamp of, yes, I've completed this. I've, done a sufficient knowledge check or assessment at the end. And 17% doing compliance. So when we think of more of that mandatory L&D training, 17% of respondents were focused on compliance.
So then as we move into the fourth pillar of education-led growth, we start getting into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff here, right? So this is resources. It's great to be able to define what you want to do and who you want to do it for. Now you've got to make sure that you're equipping programs with the necessary skills and tools and support. And this could be anything from making sure you have the right instructional design folks and assets, to exploring tools to help you with AI-driven content creation, or providing enough technical support to be able to launch and maintain these programs. So resourcing is the whole gamut of tools and people that will support the scalability and the sustainability and help you dive into the measurable impact that your programs are meant to deliver. So you've got to be able to account for resourcing as you're building out a program. And Shannon, maybe you can speak to some of the data that is on the slide here.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different research, and you'll see a couple different, so this particular research is not from the education-led growth research, because there's already a lot of research out there around how people are staffing their teams or tools and technology. So this is from a 2024 research report, just talking about the size of education teams and what are the roles that people have on teams. And so you'll notice that most teams have content developers. Obviously, content is king. We've got to have good content to educate and train whoever it is that we're educating and training. Trainers and instructors. So if we have people doing live training, in person or virtual instructor-led training, director level management, a learning platform admin. So as your program grows, you might have someone dedicated to the administration of your learning content through your learning management system. And then our subject matter experts, our SMEs. And I think something that important to highlight here around resourcing is that we tend to index a lot on those first two roles, on the content developers, the trainers and instructors. We actually need a diversity of roles. And so in the beginning of, and we're going to talk about this next week with our guest, Katie, she's going to be talking about starting a partner education program and kind of how she built out her team. But we might have some people who are a little bit more generalist until we have a need for specialists. But I would encourage people to think beyond just content development and training to also, how are we delivering this? Next up, we're going to talk about delivery. How are we delivering this to our learners And then also who is thinking about that strategy and that approach, who's thinking about the tools and technology and how we're measuring things and reporting back to the business, making sure that we have like a well-stacked team and that we're considering all these different roles and how we resource our team to be most effective. This is from 2024 Forrester research. So last, I want to say January, February, March, Forrester surveyed 150 customer education leaders and then commissioned a report that was published, I want to say May of last year. So this is relatively recent data. And they were looking at a 5-year trend pattern of how are people resourcing their teams and how has that changed over the last 5 years. It was interesting to note that the amount of in-house team members has decreased over time. So that research found that the investment in education was increasing, but the number of people in-house was decreasing. So more people are looking to, whether it's third-party vendors or AI content creation tools, right? That really became more of something that we could actually do last year. And so more people are looking at that, and the tools are like rapidly becoming way better and way more reasonable. Like if we think about doing more with less. And then also agency partners, right? So you see that 10 percentage point increase over 5 years of agency partners helping. And so a lot of this is really kind of outsourcing content creation, not because we can't do it in-house, but because as we look at the best, most effective use of our resources, maybe we have internal SMEs, or we have trainers and instructors, or we have that director, head of education level person, and then we're outsourcing some of that content development. So as you're thinking about resources, there's so many different ways that you can approach this. And this is just to give you some data points to see what are other people doing, to give you maybe some ideas of what you might want to apply to your own program.
And then when we move into the fifth pillar of education-led growth, we start to get into delivery. And so this is how you employ different diverse learning formats. I mean, self-paced modules, live training, certifications, right? You want to meet learners where they are, and you want to match the scope and the nature of the content with a delivery mechanism that makes sense. That ensures that the education is accessible, so learners can find it easier and quicker, that it's timely, it's impacting them at the right point in their journey. And just like we saw some shifts on the resourcing side, we've also seen some shifts on the delivery side, as you can see here. Shannon, you've got a few things that you highlighted here that are different in, from 2019 to 2024 in that Forrester report.
Yeah, so this is also data from the Forrester report, just showing how are people delivering education and training. And so in 2019, number one was in-person training and workshops. And if we think about how is the macroeconomic environment impacting our day-to-day work, well, with COVID, none of us were really doing in-person training anymore, right? We rightfully had to pivot, and that was necessarily going to drop. And I don't think it's going to be a surprise to a lot of people to see kind of this rise in-app guides of this just-in-time learning where, yes, like long-form formalized learning has its place, and studies have shown it actually drives more business impact, right? If you only have in-app guides, this is not a comprehensive education program. It's a part of a well-rounded education program. But those in-app guides just grew and just shot to the top, right? So in-app guides weren't even on the 2019 list, shot to the top of 2024. Training videos, again, some of that just-in-time learning, like how do we get people unstuck? So if you think about that education initiative of skills and enablement, how do we keep people moving forward and using our product? And they don't have to take a full certification is awesome and great, depending on who it is that you're training and what it is that you're trying to get from them. But a lot of people just need to know enough to take the next step and then the next step. So you're seeing this rise in just-in-time learning material. And something I think is important to call out is certifications didn't go away, right? So some people have read this data and this visual is saying that certification programs are no longer important. Percentage-wise, the same percentage of people were doing certification programs in 2019 and in 2024. It's just that these other more, referenceable content or self-serve learning grew in popularity in the last 5 years. So that's how to read that. But there really is, I think, something important here on every part of this education-led growth framework is there's no one-size-fits-all approach, right? If we're thinking about what is our business outcome that we're trying to drive toward and who's our audience and what is it that people need, there is no one right content format and there's no one right delivery format. So I'm thinking about a customer that we have when they're training their employees are on the go. They don't have time. They're almost never sitting in front of a computer and learning. And so they intentionally created mobile learning using our mobile app to be able to train employees on the go. So just really understanding who is it, what is the time that they have available, how are they consuming content, how can we get that to them? So to Anderson's point, it is accessible, it is friendly, it is meeting them where they're at. I think that's a huge part of when we think about delivery. How are we getting it into the hands of the people in a way that they need, want, expect?
Yeah, and I think that that's such a great example because you can see how there were like other pillars that were invoked to get to that particular delivery channel as well, right? Because they understood their audience, they resourced around that. So you can start to see how all these things begin to overlap and get you to the right solution at the right time for your program and for your content. So once you have started thinking through like what is the content going to be, how are we going to deliver that to the right audience, you still need to get learners and keep them engaged. And that's where this sixth pillar comes in, and that's marketing. And I know that this is probably not one that jumps to the forefront of folks' minds when you're thinking about an education program, but marketing your program is super important. In the education-led growth framework, marketing helps you position education as integral to even your go-to-market efforts, your company-wide go-to-market efforts, by linking it to other areas of the business like demand generation and sales enablement and customer success. And we'll spend some time looking at data related to each one of these ways that we can think about marketing. But learner acquisition, probably the most obvious, is how do people even know that there is a learning program that's designed to help meet a particular need for them, right? You have to get the learners to make them aware of that, especially if it's non-compulsory. So when you're marketing to internal employees, things like a leadership development program for career advancement, like your employees have to become aware of that, and they need to know at a high level, like, how does this benefit me? What's the value that this delivers? Or customers or partners, those learners need to be made aware of your learning programs in general, because oftentimes there's not sort of a stick that you can use to get them to engage in those programs in the first place. And then once you've gotten them there, how do you keep them engaged? How do you re-engage learners when you start to see that there is some drop-off as they're moving through the content that you have planned for them? And then the third piece that's on here is the role of education in go-to-market strategy. Sydney Sloan, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of G2, she likes to say, smart, happy customers buy more. I think we spend a lot of time and energy on the happy part, but we often overlook the smart part. Education has a role to play when we're talking to prospects or when we're talking to customers about growing and expanding the products and services that we sell to them that make them happy. So we have data around each of these. So why don't we look at these in a little bit more detail, Shannon?
Yeah, and this is where I'll highlight and promote. Next month, we're going to dive into marketing your education program. So if this is something that you're already thinking of, all these things we've talked about so far, this is an area of growth for me. You're totally not alone, and we're going to deep dive into that next month. But just some data points here, right? So if you're wondering, what are other people doing to market their programs? Some data to back it up. Not surprisingly, a lot of people are using email marketing to promote, and this would be initial awareness, right? How are you initially promoting your education programs? So a lot of email marketing and also personalized outreach from other departments. I want to say it was last February. If you go find this, it's called Beyond the Borders. We did an underscore around collaborating with cross-functional teams, right? Because our customer success teams or our sales teams or our partner success teams or even product and support teams, right? They're all interacting with customers, and we want to have them be equipped to share the work that we're doing, right? How are they communicating, whether it's incorporating it into kickoff calls or QBRs or conversations or in response to support tickets? Hey, you might find this course over here, this video over here to be helpful. We want to equip other teams to share education content. Also in-app messaging, right? So you have in-app guides that maybe give you a walkthrough or tutorial of something, but you might also have in-app messaging that says, hey, like, need help with this. And then it links out to your learning management system for more of a deep dive, or it links to a help article, just kind of depending on what the relevant resource is there. So you can see some of the tactics that people are using just kind of in terms of priority. And then in terms of re-engagement, how are we keeping people coming back? And again, if you're focused on skills and enablement, how do we keep people learning about our product over time as it changes, as we add new features and functionality? This is how people are continuing to market and promote their programs. So again, email campaigns, a new thing comes out. I always think that email is great, but we don't want to stop there, right? In the same way that we don't want to launch a product, email about it one time, and then wipe our hands of it. We want to continue to market and promote. So we have folks hosting regular webinars or live sessions, right? So maybe hosting office hours or things where you're surfacing tips and tricks or insider knowledge or what's new in the platform. Automated reminder emails. If you're not using automated emails, this is a fantastic, you just set it up and then you don't even have to think about it anymore. People can be reminded to come back and continue learning. Incentives and gamification. So people are looking at how do we, right? Anderson was saying, especially in external learning, we don't usually have a stick. We mostly just have the carrot. How do we use the carrot really well to encourage and motivate people to learn? And then the last bit here, I pressed the wrong button on my screen. There we go. Education in a company's go-to-market strategy. So we ask people, how is your education integrated into your go-to-market strategy? And if it is, what is it doing? Like, how is it supporting? So not surprisingly, we see it supporting customer onboarding and adoption. That's awesome. That's a great use case for education. It's helping to build brand loyalty and customer retention. Also great, right? When I think about some of the best products, it's products that have taught me how to use it well, where I feel like I'm a confident consumer. If I don't feel like a confident consumer, none of us really like to feel like we're bad at something. So how do we help people be, to Anderson's language, smart, or I guess Sydney's language, how do we be smart customers? Partner enablement, generating upsell and cross-sell opportunities. So the numbers here are very akin to what we saw last year in the Forrester research, is that a lower percentage of people are using education for demand gen, for attracting new leads and new business, for upsell and cross-sell opportunities. But we're starting to see more people thinking about that, of how do we actually use education to surface what's possible in our product, new problems that you could solve in the product, and how do we kind of whet their appetite for that? And then 20% of people said it's not integrated into our go-to-market strategy, which is sad, but also indicates, there's some room to grow here. And hopefully the language that we're providing you with today helps you to communicate to your executive team what other companies are doing and how education can fit into the go-to-market strategy, right? Because this is just like a missing piece. We're also, underneath this video is some attachments. We've worked on some ebooks, guides. So if you're focused on external education, there's a version for you. If you're focused on internal education, there's a version for you to give you language to communicate to your executive team the value of education, because we actually genuinely believe this is the missing piece. Regardless of your go-to-market motion, if education is not, interwoven in that, you're going to have a really hard time being successful, because we just can't leave this part out.
Yeah, and this is the piece that personally I'm the most excited about, because as you heard from the beginning, I was introducing myself, I love thinking about go-to-market strategy. And I think that education deserves a seat at the table. Oftentimes organizations think go-to-market strategy, well, that's the domain of sales, or that's the domain of marketing, because it's so much about like, how do we reach and engage target customers? How do we surface leads and move them through our marketing and sales funnels and move them through the pipeline? And then once they convert to being customers, then we'll educate them. But I think that there's a lot that education can offer to the market to help shape how the market and how leads are thinking about product categories, product capabilities, the pain points, the way that your product solves those, that's differentiated from all of your competitors out there, so that you're starting to shape the mind of how people think about what they want to buy. And you shape it in a way, of course, that's bent right towards your solution or your services. So I hope that we see this go up a little bit, the percentage of people that are saying, hey, education is part of our go-to-market strategy. We understand the value that our education programs can add to lead generation and to customer growth and expansion. So I think that we'll see this one move. We can go to the final pillar, which is measurement. This is all well and good, everything we've talked about, but we can't just stop at the place of just like strongly asserting that education adds value to a business or an organization, right? We have to be able to track that back. So if we're identifying business outcomes for our initiatives, then we need to have the tooling and the instrumentation and the metrics to be able to back that up. So we want to track how education is having an impact on those business outcomes, like revenue impact and retention and efficiency. So you have to establish some pretty clear reporting practices around that. You want to ensure that there's accountability there, both for yourselves and for the other parts of the organization that you're collaborating with. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. So you got to make sure you have metrics in place and ways that you're measuring against those metrics. Well, the way you do that maybe is, we'll know we're successful if program X achieves metric Y. Like that's a good framework if you can draw that line there.
Yeah, that's one that our chief operations officer uses a lot. We'll know this is successful if it achieves X as measured by Y, right? So I think when we think business outcomes first, and we should be developing learning that ties to business outcomes, which means we have to start at the top. But how are we measuring that? And if you think about the concept of leading and lagging indicators, customer retention is going to be a lagging indicator. You're not going to know immediately if your education or training has moved the needle on customer retention, but you might have leading indicators, right? We might see an increase in product adoption. So if our hypothesis is that that education is going to lead to increased product adoption, which is going to lead to an increase in customer retention, we're going to measure that by, once people complete this course, we expect to see an increase in product usage, whether that's frequency, breadth of use, depth of use, the different features that they're using, right? So we want to be specific about what we're measuring, so we're not kind of arbitrarily saying, education is meant to improve retention, but how are we actually proving that it's doing that? So we ask people, how long after launching an education initiative do you start measuring its impact on business goals? 25% said immediately, which is awesome. Good for you. Sounds like you have some good data systems set up. 35% within 3 months. And then we start to see, 6 to 12 months, a year or more, are not consistently measured. And so this is just kind of like the at a glance. But as we're doing a deeper dive into the relationship between different questions, not surprisingly, what we're finding is that people who very soon after, right, immediately or within 3 months, measure the success of their education initiative, those people are more likely to report successful outcomes. And I think we could probably infer that knowing what it is that you're trying to measure, setting it up in the beginning is helpful in improving the value of your program. We asked people, what analytic tools are you using, right? And I was really curious about this one because I'm like, where does the data live and is it all connected? Not surprisingly, 71% of people are using their learning management system. There's a lot of data that you can capture in your learning management system, not just around engagement, but also around sentiment. And depending on your product, like if you're an Intellum customer, you can tie that to other business data, right? So you could actually prove and map to business outcomes. Folks are also using survey and feedback platforms. So if you're administering CSAT surveys, if you're doing thumbs up, thumbs down on help articles, if you're asking for feedback after your instructor-led training, we're collecting data there. I'm thrilled to see that 41% of people have data visualization tools, customer success tools, support software, right? So if you're trying to improve customer success, product adoption, customer retention, maybe you're integrating with a customer success tool, or if you're trying to decrease support tickets, maybe you're partnering with that support software. So full report will have like a whole laundry list. These were kind of the top tools people are using. And then I also wanted to know, or we wanted to know, I was really curious, like what makes this hard, right? Because I always think some of this is like, well, duh, of course we should measure. But I want to know like what keeps people from measuring, like what makes that not possible for us today. And not surprising here either is this lack of integration between systems, which makes it hard to consolidate data. So if you're in that world where you've got all these measurement analytics platforms, but they're not actually talking to each other, you're in good company, but it is definitely a problem for us to solve, right? Of how do we take all this disparate data and make it talk so we can actually start to prove things. 43% said they don't have access to other platforms, right? So maybe you don't have access to your CRM, maybe you don't have access to your sales data, and that's going to make it hard to really prove the impact there. Our CXO, Greg Rose, was sharing last year at TSIA, one way that we can overcome this challenge is like, maybe there is sensitive customer data that we don't have access to that platform, and that's fine. But can we find the people who have the keys to the kingdom and partner with them and say, hey, can I give you people who completed this course or completed this certification or who attended this training? Can you look at the relationship, or people who do this more likely to see Y outcome? And then they can do that analysis, right? So if there's sensitive data in there, we totally understand. But, we also just need to know, is our work working? And then folks lack clear metrics or KPIs to define success. And Matt actually asked a question around this in the chat. So I think it's a good time to kind of pull it in here is, if your business goal, you're trying to improve customer success, right? What are your metrics for that? And I think sometimes we're often told like what to do or what to create. I need you to create a certification. I need a course. I need you to do this training on whatever. And sometimes we're kind of dictated that. And I think that's where, if you don't have clear goals that the business has said, is to use what you've learned here, use what you're learning from your peers to say, hey, we believe that education can really move the needle on this, that, and the other thing. Like, we believe that we can actually increase product adoption and we can measure it in this way, or we believe that we can increase frequency of use, or we can increase the adoption of this particular feature, or we think that we can expose people to new parts of the product through education and training, and we can see a difference in expansion and opportunities, right? So you can actually like form those hypotheses, pitch those, and start to measure progress toward that. So even if someone has not given you a goal, you still have the opportunity to bring to the table, hey, well, other companies are using education to do this. I think we could do that as well. Does that sound reasonable to you? And most people aren't going to say no. Like, if in the absence of a goal, I think you set a goal, you track the goal, and you start to show what education can do for the business.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the hardest problems for us to solve, as you've highlighted. I'm so glad that you had the foresight to start like digging into this question, like in the first version of this survey that you put out there. But I think it's one of the areas where there is opportunity for education programs to really think in a very mature organizational way, because when you start connecting your outcomes to metrics that matter, sounds like a great webinar series, but when you start connecting your outcomes to metrics that matter for an organization, organizationally, that increases the credibility of the programs that you're running. So when you start digging in and saying, like, I want the data to show that the work that I'm doing is making a positive impact on the organization, you'll start to find that it becomes easier then to ask for resources and justify the spend for that. It becomes easier for you to then propose additional education programs, because again, we're moving this perception of education being a cost center to a growth driver. And this is where the data is really going to be able to help you do that.
All right, so we've covered a lot, and we did these slides. You'll also find those in the attachments under the video. So if you want to come back, you want these data points, like full research coming out next month, but if it's helpful for you to have some of this data and language to communicate, you can download the deck underneath the video. We're going to move to a time in Q&A, and Andrews and I talked about this ahead of time to just acknowledge, like, we don't have all the answers, right? This is something, education is such a nuanced industry. And just because you've done one thing doesn't mean that you've done it all. It doesn't mean that you know everything. So we're constantly learning. And that's part of this series, is we're learning from you, we're learning from each other. We're learning from the people who have gone before us in different areas. And so we're trying to bring people in to share what it is that they've done, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what they've learned along the way. So you can go ahead underneath this video, you can ask questions, and we will do our best to answer or find you an answer or find someone who can answer your question. But also I'll just put a call out too, right? I mentioned underneath this video, you can, I'll go to the next slide here, share your feedback, but go ahead, rate the session, but also say things that you want to learn about, or if you're killing it in one of these areas, let us know underneath the video, and then come on a future underscore and tell us about what you're measuring and how you're measuring it, or how you overcame a data challenge, or how you're marketing your program. Because we just definitely, this whole industry gets better when we learn from each other. I do see there's a question in the chat about curious how skill development frameworks adoption has changed over this time frame. And so I'm curious, is this around the 2019, 2024 for customer education? Was that the reference for this question?
I think that probably was based off of when the question came in. We were talking through some of the Forrester report data at that time.
Okay. Yeah. So that research did not cover specifically skill development frameworks. But if folks are not familiar, that can actually be a great resource for building learning that actually builds skills that then translate to how you use your product. So I know Vicki Kennedy has been talking about this a lot, sharing some skill development frameworks. So it could be a great person to follow if you're curious to learn more about that. But using a skills-based framework can also help you if you're multi-purposing learning across audiences. So if you're trying to educate multiple people on the same skills, like a skill development framework could be useful as well.
Yeah, and while I don't have data to back this up, it is my hunch that we will continue to see skills development frameworks employed more both for internal and for external types of learning as we continue to put pressure on education programs to prove out their ROI. So being able to tie the kinds of learning that's happening within your education programs to measurable skills in your customer set or your partner set or your employee set will become a valuable way of tracking the efficacy of those programs.
Awesome. Okay. Lindsay asks, how do you help non-education leaders like marketing understand the value of customer education when you don't have access to every metric you need? Anderson, do you have thoughts? I have thoughts, but I'll, if you have thoughts first.
Yeah, I mean, I think I come from a place where a little bit of a unique background in that I was in different types of education first before making my way into marketing. So I kind of like carried it in with me. But I think that part of it starts with just understanding or helping marketing understand the kind of reach that your education programs can have and how that is consistent with the value-based messaging that they're trying to get out into the market in general. That you all are you're interacting with the same people just at different places in their journey, and they will be able to help you then kind of unlock some of those metrics that you need to be able to partner with you better on both marketing your programs, but also understanding the value that an educational approach to marketing can have on the work that they're doing. What do you got, Shannon?
Well, I was going to promote next week's webinar with Katie Bernal because she's going to talk about how do you communicate when you're, when some things take time to measure, right? Because the tracking's not in place, the reporting's not in place, you're waiting for a certain period of time to pass before you can do analysis, but we really can't sit on our thumbs waiting. So how do we start to communicate things that show value or show that there's traction, and how do we keep education top of mind for people? So I think that'll be really helpful to hear from her. She grew and scaled Alarm.com's partner education program. So if you want to hear from someone who has definitely done this, I did pitch customer education to my CMO at a previous company. And so I think it's really important to understand who is it that you're talking to, what matters to them, and then also what's their background and context. So if you take the time, right, in the same way that you would do a needs analysis, if you take the time to understand what matters to these stakeholders, what are their goals, what are their problems, what keeps them up at night, how can education be part of that solution? What I did for this CMO when I was pitching it was I looked at her previous companies. And so I noticed that some of her previous companies had customer education programs, like more formalized academies. And so I was like, hey, how did that work for you at this company? How did that work for you at this company? And then I showed how I thought we actually had a very, very great opportunity to become thought leaders in this space and to use education for lead generation, not just for product adoption, which we were kind of already doing product training webinars, but to actually educate and train the market. And so I was talking to Anderson earlier because they've actually done that since then. So I didn't have a chance to work on that because there were just some reorg things that happened like literally 3 days after that conversation. But they have done that since then. So I think just taking the time to get to know who are these people and what matters to them helps you in tailoring your pitch, because what matters to your CMO is mostly going to be lead generation, lead quality, and how are you driving pipeline. And so if you can show, and I would use HubSpot Academy is a great example. And I'll find this, Lindsay. I'm going to take a screenshot of your name and then send you a podcast where one of their education leaders was talking about how they used it for education for marketing and sales. And he actually was on a webinar last year too. So I'll send you that too.
And I think that there's some other types of inputs that education can feed into marketing that marketing cares about. And part of it's learning the language of marketing, right? So customer education leaders often understand what the pain points are and the way that that your customers actually articulate that pain, sometimes better than marketers do. But marketers want to know that information. So if you can help your marketing folks understand, listen, our customers are finding a lot of value out of using these features or these capabilities in our product to solve this kind of pain. And here's how they articulate that pain. That's a valuable input back up into marketing, because they'll start to use that to frame their messaging. And so showing that customer education and the things that you're learning there have a direct input into how marketing can then frame their materials and their go-to-market motion starts to at least engender marketing to customer education just as a function. And then I think that starts to grease the wheels to open up more collaboration between the two. And I know on a future webinar, we're going to look specifically at marketing your customer education programs. And one of the areas I'm really interested to dig into is how customer education and marketing can partner together to do more top of funnel programmatic things that leverages customer education or an education approach to help drive demand and generate leads. I think there's some really compelling things that we can do when we collaborate together.
Yeah, which leads kind of into Juan's question here. Would you consider this webinar a type of customer education that you all have implemented? If so, I'm curious, how did you get buy-in from leadership to put out this series? That's a great question. I don't know that we would consider this part of customer education. I think I would think of this as kind of like educational marketing, because the purpose for this is not necessarily that you're using a part of our product or learning a new skill. I have no way to test or assess at the end of this that you have learned what we thought that you were going to learn. But we do use this series to share the things that we're learning and to provide information and education, but it's just not necessarily like developed in a way that you're learning something very specific and then going and applying it. And we have a way to measure and assess that. Anderson, do you have different kind of perspectives on that?
Well, I would say yes. And yes, I wouldn't say that it is customer education in the ways that we conventionally think about customer education. I might say that it is prospect or market education, that what we're doing, the reason we do these webinars is because they fit into our education-led growth plan, is that we know that if we educate the market, whether that is customers or prospects, so if you're a customer today, hey, if you're not a customer yet today, also hey, we have value that we can give you in terms of thought leadership. If we were to go into more of like a sales pitchy marketing pitch kind of deal right now, I could walk you through how every single one of the pieces of the education-led growth framework, every one of those pillars is actionable in the Intellum product. Like I could make that one-for-one map for you. We may do that on like a customer education focused course or path or certification on how to build an education-led growth program using the Intellum platform and Intellum Evolve. We may offer that to our customers at some point in the future. That would be the same kind of content, but now squarely like customer education. But still what we're doing today, I think, is educational. It sounds like you all have learned something. And it's part of the way that we hope to grow Intellum's business by providing thought leadership and opportunities for professionals like yourselves to connect with us and connect with one another.
So yes, and I think if you expand the definition of customer, right? Like, not everybody's a paid customer today, but doesn't mean like you won't be a customer in the future, right? Yeah, but different goals and objectives and different ways that things are structured. Last question here from Basha. How do you correlate learning engagement, like enrollments, completion rates, things like that, with product adoption and customer retention data to measure the business impact? Is there industry research or templates for how to calculate that? And because we're running up on the hour here, I'm going to send you, but I would encourage folks too, if you're interested, drop a note. I will read through every single comment underneath this video if you're interested, because we have a guide to defining metrics that includes how do you analyze data in relationship with each other. But we also had a customer who wrote an incredible blog on what she called the impact ladder of how do we take those engagement level metrics and how do we tie that to business outcomes, and then how she did that with her company, kind of created something in tandem with their BI team to show to the business just how impactful education was. So if you're interested in those resources, let us know underneath the video. We are coming right up on time here. So thank you, Anderson, for walking us through the education-led growth framework. Thank you, everybody who joined us today, asked questions. We hope that this was helpful. Please take a moment to leave us some feedback underneath the video, and we will see you again soon. Bye, everybody.